Hi, we are really excited to have Gokul here. Gokul's an absolute favorite in Pine Labs. We've worked very closely with Gokul, where he's advised us over the last 2 years on various moves that we've been making in Pine Labs. Gokul has worked before with Facebook, Google, and now is with Doordash. He calls himself as a product helper at Doordash. What that means is he's working on figuring out the go forward strategy for Doordash. Gokul, welcome.
Thank you very much, Amrish. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today.
Thanks for making time. Hey, look, Gokul, I'm going to start with a fairly simple question. You have this unique experience of having worked with some great startups in the US and also having invested in the Indian startup scene. What are the similarities and differences that you have noticed?
This is a great question, Amrish. I would say that first and foremost, it's been incredible for me to see how the Indian startup ecosystem has emerged over the past decade. I remember meeting the Flipkart founders about 14 or 15 years ago when they were getting started, and they were still fairly green and young, very smart. But today, when I meet an entrepreneur from India, I know that pound for pound, their knowledge of the space, their hunger, their motivation, and the market they're going after is as large, as compelling as any top entrepreneur worldwide. And I think there are three reasons for this. First, I think societal. A decade ago, joining or founding a startup still had some social stigma in India associated with it. Today, thanks to all the great startups and founders, and the press is full of their stories, joining a startup is actually considered something cool, something that, especially from a parental point of view, it's acceptable and exciting for young people to do so. Second, over the last few years, exodus of top talent has been incredible. 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of top talent would be sticking around in consulting or banking or FMCG companies, but now they're moving en masse to technology. And third, liquidity events. I think liquidity events of Indian companies, obviously Zomato and Freshworks today that filed, and all of these amazing liquidity events, especially going public, are proving that you don't just need to be bought by a multinational company to get an exit, but there is massive liquidity opportunities available to Indian companies, either on the Indian stock exchanges or in the NASDAQ or NYSE in the US. One of the biggest challenges, and I think this is where the difference is, where Indian companies are challenged a little bit, is finding executives who've been there, done that, and who've seen scaling and hypergrowth. And this is one of the biggest, I would say, challenges that Indian startups struggle with. But hopefully grizzled veterans like you and I can hopefully fill in the gaps as advisors to companies and help them, because the number of startups and number of people who've seen that is increasing by the day, by the week, by the year. So I think it's only a few years before that will also cease to be an issue. But hopefully in the interim, we can help companies bridge that gap. Amrish, let me ask you a question. What's your perspective on this topic? You've worked with multinational companies for the last 20 plus years, and you've had a ringside seat to the emergence and growth of the Indian startup ecosystem. How's it different today versus, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
I mean, I think the difference is the difference between the way Rahul Dravid used to play his game and how Rishabh Pant is playing his game. Rahul Dravid used to, protect his wicket, leave the balls. Rishabh Pant wants to do a reverse sweep out there. I think that's exactly what's happening with the Indian entrepreneur. The Indian entrepreneur has become very ambitious, wants to do different things, and the entrepreneur is ready to fail. I think that's a big change than what it was just like 10 years back. When I look at my time, when I went into the corporate world, everybody wanted to go into a safe job. Things have changed in recent times. To your point and what you just talked about, the other interesting piece about what has changed in terms of liquidity events is 10 years back, an IPO was considered to be an exit. Today, an IPO is almost considered as one of the milestones, almost to propel you to greater heights. So when you look at what Zomato is doing and what Freshworks is doing, I can see them getting propelled 10x from here, which is a big change from just 10 years back. And of course, in the US, some of the companies that you've worked with, Gokul, they have just gone stronger after the IPO. Let's take the example of Square. I didn't mention this in your introduction. You worked with Square for a really long time. And in your days, you guys pretty much reinvented the checkout. How was that experience, and how did you think about offline payments and retailers?
That's a great question, Amrish. Let me actually take a couple of steps back and expound a little bit on the story of Square, because it'll give a sense of how Square thought about customer problems. The story of Square overall, when I think about it, is one of first principles thinking around customer problems. The founding story starts with a guy called Jim McKelvey. He used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was an artist by profession. He built glass sculptures and sold glass sculptures. One day, he got a call from a woman in Panama, the country of Panama, who wanted to buy one of his glass sculptures. And this thing retailed for $2,000, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, thousands of dollars. But she wanted to give him her Amex card over the phone, and that's how she wanted to pay for it. Now, Jim said, can't you just send a cashier's check or some other instrument, because he had been rejected by his bank from accepting payments, from card payments. And she said, no, I only have this Amex card. It protects me from fraud and all of these things, so I can only use this card. And of course, he couldn't accept the card, so he lost the sale. And he was really disappointed and upset after that. So he called his friend Jack Dorsey, who had just left Twitter. He was the founder of Twitter, and he just left Twitter. He started complaining to Jack about the sale he had lost and the fact that he was a small business person in good standing, but he couldn't get approved by banks to accept card payments. And so when they were talking about this problem, they realized that they were both holding in their hands, respective hands, these powerful computers that had massive processing power even compared to a few years back, and can do lots of things. And of course, I refer to the smartphone here. So they started thinking, is there a way that we can use a smartphone to solve this fundamental business problem that Jim faced? Neither of them had done anything in payments, knew nothing about hardware, but they started with the core of a problem: how to get small businesses like Jim McKelvey to be accepted for card payments when they were in perfectly good standing and denied by banks. And so that's how Square was born. Initially, it was just a simple payment screen where you entered an amount, and there was something you probably could call a dongle that plugged into the audio jack of the phone or the iPad, and you swipe the card. As Square started taking off and started to be used, they observed this interesting customer behavior. There was something called a memo field or a notes field when you accepted the payment. They saw that people were starting to type things like 2 croissants or 1 espresso in it. They realized that merchants were actually using Square as a point of sale, because they were itemizing the payments. They were saying, here's what I'm selling, because they didn't have a point of sale. They had a cash register, and that's what they were replacing it with. So they essentially understood that this was the behavior, and they built a point of sale as part of the Square application. And that's basically the story of Square. And then a few years later, they saw that the point of sale was being used differently by 3 different segments. Restaurants were using point of sale differently, then retailers who were selling prepared goods, then service providers. Square had a lot of service providers using it. For example, people who give piano lessons or golf instruction. They were using it very differently than restaurants who were selling food, than retailers who were selling finished goods. So they basically realized that checkout flow needs to be different for each of these segments, and created teams for each of them to focus on the unique customer needs. The one thing that Square didn't focus on, and that's because of the focus on the customer segment, is pure online retailers. And I think Square always focused on omnichannel commerce, which is retailers who sell both offline and online. So the online part of Square's offering is closely tied to the offline part. And a lot of effort is spent to make sure that inventory can just be created once and is in sync between various channels. Similarly, when a customer buys online, you can then do customer support for them offline or vice versa. So you have one store of customer data and feedback. And so Square took a different approach than, say, a Stripe or a Braintree in the US, which were very focused on online e-commerce merchants going after the Ubers and the Doordashes of the world. But Square stayed focused on the offline retailer who was then at that point transitioning to an online world. And of course, COVID accelerated it. And it had to almost be done reverse, where for many merchants, online became the primary channel and offline became a little less important for a time being. But that's a story of Square. And really, it's a story of first principles customer thinking. Understand customer problems and start from what customer problem are you trying to solve. Understand how customer is using your product, what hacks they are creating, and using those hacks to then inform your product roadmap going forward. Amrish, I'm curious, Pine Labs, obviously you guys are leaders in payments in India. Tell me about how you and the Pine Labs team rework the customer experience at Pine Labs for Pine Labs merchants. Did you focus on the offline experience, the online experience, both? How are you thinking about it?
So, that's a great question, Gokul. In fact, the theme of our conference right now is fintech interconnected, right? What we are getting to see is the lines between what's an offline transaction and what's an online transaction is completely getting blurred. The consumer doesn't see a difference between a UPI QR code transaction and then using a contactless card for making payments. What's contactless? Both of them are contactless. We want to play in solving for merchants' payments experience at the checkout. But to your point, we also want to work with the merchant when it comes to the larger commerce requirements. And that's a big change within Pine Labs. And to be honest, you have been one of those people who have actually helped us crystallize our thoughts in that direction. So thank you very much for that. One of the things that I've been reading about Gokul at this point is QR code seems to have taken off in US through the pandemic period. And then, of course, FedNow is going to come up with its own solution in the next 2 to 3 years' time. So when you have RTP, real-time payments, and proliferation of QR across the country, how do you think consumer behavior will change? How do you think fintech adoption in the US population will change?
This is a really interesting question about the future of financial services and financial technology in the US. QR codes have been around for a few years now, as you know, but COVID really enabled or really accelerated the rise in usage. Most of us had probably used QR code once or twice as a novelty before last year, 2020. But in 2020, when you went out, because of contactless, almost everything became QR code enabled. And so people became, just in the US at least, much, much more comfortable. I think outside the US, you saw all these places where people in many European countries, Asian countries, people were already using contactless checkout, QR codes, etc. But in the US, it was not a accepted behavior, in the mainstream accepted behavior outside of a few tech-enabled enclaves. And now you actually have, even when we go out to dine at a restaurant, many restaurants don't have menus anymore. They just have a QR code that you just scan and you access the menu, no paper menus anymore. And so behaviors are changing as a result. And so what we are seeing is a proliferation in consumer payment apps. So there's at least a dozen startups, and this is probably true of Europe and the US, that are trying to build a next generation payment app that allows businesses to accept payments to start with from consumers in the store using QR codes, but then essentially expanding obviously beyond that, because once you have the consumer using this app to pay, you have much more information about the consumer, you have CRM data, et cetera, et cetera. So they're trying to build, essentially trying to take the point of sale that used to exist as a separate device and move it to your phone. Essentially, the point of sale is moving into the consumer's pocket, if you will. It'll be very interesting to see how it plays out, but definitely mass acceleration as a result of this. On the other topic you mentioned, FedNow, it's again been something that we've talked about at every fintech conference with every fintech company for a few years. Hopefully it's going to come to fruition soon. It's essentially an initiative by the Federal Reserve, like you said, to develop a new round-the-clock real-time payment and settlement service so that people can get their funds instantly when you make payment. The ACH system today takes 1 to 2 days. And if there's a weekend, it could take 3-4 days for payments to clear. And the number one thing we heard when we used to ask merchants at Square about their pain point is, I want faster access to my money. Always number one. And Square built a lot of innovations to get merchants their money faster, but it was perpetually number one. And so whether it's merchants or consumers, people want faster access to money. Working capital is one of the biggest issues for small businesses. And getting access to money, when you take a payment, getting access to money faster will be a godsend to businesses large and small. The challenge, of course, is that this can also result in fraud. Because if you take a payment and if you're a fraudster and you get that payment instantly, it doesn't give you any, if there's no protection or buffer to protect against fraud. And so somebody is going to be on the hook for that. And so I suspect that the ability for payment process and the whole fintech ecosystem to detect fraud and become much more sophisticated at fraud needs to improve dramatically, because real-time fraud, the amount of losses can be staggering if you're not smart about it. Amrish, I'm curious, what are 1 to 2 upcoming innovations in Indian fintech that you're excited about?
Actually, you talked a bit about it. So for me, the big thing which is happening right now is, again, real-time payments and what UPI is doing. UPI is actually changing the way I talk to you, but how I move money to you also. And that's a big change as compared to just 5 years back. And UPI from just retail payments have now started to get into IPO purchases, and then moving forward, potentially it could get into business-to-business payments. And I think that's going to open up many, many new opportunities. So faster payments is something which I feel very excited about. I think the second part which I'm super excited about is around embedded finance. So to your point again, when it comes to credit, if it's embedded in your daily life, and that could be in a form of a BNPL, or it could be form of any other lines which are getting created, I think that's going to be very, very important. There have been enough and more studies around the world which has shown that the GDP of the country has been impacted positively based on the flow of credit. So if we can move credit in India easily, it will have a big impact on the Indian economy. So quite excited with both RTP and also with embedded finance. But what this also does is it puts a lot of pressure on various founders and the startups that they are working in. And of course, the product managers out there. The way I look at it is product managers' lives have changed in the last 4 to 5 years, because what's really happened is the future seems to have been accelerated. So on one side, they are problem solving for today, but also they need to behave like a visionary, trying to understand what could happen in the next 2 to 3 years' time. How do you handle this, Gokul? How do you look at this challenge right now?
This is a question that's a perpetual question, because the product manager role seems like a really sexy role, right? Everyone wants to be a PM. You talk to young computer science grads now, they all want to be PMs. But it's actually, what they don't realize is it is one of the most complex and challenging in all of technology. Why? Because A, there's no curriculum that teaches it. You don't go to school learning to be a PM. You specialize in a functional discipline. The product manager essentially, and good product managers can come from many backgrounds. They could be ex-engineers, ex-designers, ex-analysts, ex-marketers. I've seen all these archetypes in product managers. PMs, like you said, need to balance the needs of today and tomorrow. But most importantly, fundamentally, they need to balance the needs of the customer with the needs of the business. What I mean by that is they need to create products that deliver value to the customer while also delivering value to the business, right? Because, of course, to deliver value to the customer, you can do amazing stuff, but if none of it makes an impact to the business because you're not pricing it properly, or you're not able to extract value for the business, that's ultimately not a win-win for both. And one of the fundamental things, I think you mentioned 2 words that are critical. The way to succeed for PMs is to have a problem-solving mindset. And I would say a problem-solving mindset based on first principles. In other words, the number one attribute I look for, I test for, I screen for at every level, all the way from junior PMs who are just becoming a PM the first time to super seniorists, are they able to problem solve from first principles? And this essentially means they use a combination of a few different things. One, quantitative data. So there's a lot of data that's available on customer behavior, especially at a company like Pine or at Doordash or at Square. There's a lot of data. So you can actually do a lot of inferences, but it has to be coupled with qualitative customer insights. So you've got to go out in the field and talk to customers. You've got to observe how customers use their product. I gave some examples from Square where you could just have looked at the data. It would never have actually told you that customer using the memo field to type these notes unless you look to see what the heck they're doing. You'd never be able to make the leap of faith or jump from being a payment processor to being a point of sale. And that's the kind of jump you need to make. And ultimately, you need to have courage of conviction. You will make bets. Some bets will be right, some bets will be wrong. But one of the essential attributes of a good PM is to make high judgment bets, which more often turn out to be right than wrong. And this obviously happens as you become more senior in your career. And high judgment bets informed by first principles and grounded in data and qualitative insights. Very, very tough job, but one of the most exciting. And like you said, Amrish, I mean, it's something that, I mean, every company, in every country, whether it's India or the US, it's hard to hire these great PMs and grow them. I'm curious, Amrish, you obviously hired many at Pine and other places. What have you seen as you hire PMs at Pine Labs? Has it been a challenge to find the right folks? What are you screening for when you look for great PMs?
Yeah, I think in general, finding great PMs, that is not such a big challenge. I guess what I find as a very big challenge is finding people at the intersection of financial services and consumer behavior. Consumer behavior on its own is extremely complex. Financial services on its own is complex. Finding somebody at the intersection is even more complex. But, Gokul, I'm actually expecting a lot of product managers have logged in and a lot of engineers have logged in to listen to you. I'm going to touch upon something which I find very interesting. Right now, I believe, and I actually saw your tweet from the other day, I believe that there is a designation inflation which is going on in the market out there. On the other hand, you're one of those who's carrying a designation which is called as product helper. I wonder why you're not called as global head of product management. I know you have some thoughts on this whole designation inflation which is happening out there. Why don't you share some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, it's a somewhat controversial topic, and I did a lot of private one-on-ones every time I tweet about this. But I believe strongly that a focus on titles can be counterproductive to a company, and it's hard to reverse once you have given off titles, especially director and VP level titles, because what happens is that instead of focusing on scope and impact, people start focusing on titles. And literally, I know people at larger companies or even smaller, fast-growing companies whose goal in life is to get to a director title or a senior director title or a VP title, and that becomes their be-all, end-all, and they are almost blind to everything else. And that's a very, very self-defeating thing because A, you're just fixated on that, and you don't really receive any feedback that doesn't mention that word. And B, once you get to that, you don't know what motivates you. You're being motivated by the wrong reasons. And so I try to head off titles in early stage startups early by talking whenever I invest in a company early where there are 10, 20 people and they haven't yet hired director or VP level people. I try to give this feedback to them. Hey, you might maybe at some point want to do that, but please avoid doing it early and delay giving the director or VP title as long as possible. It's hard because in many cases, startups feel that giving a title is one of the ways they can compete with companies where they're pulling these people from. But if they can avoid that temptation, it'll save them a lot of pain. Because one of the classic patterns I see is we are firing our VP of engineering because turns out they came from a company where it was not a good fit. Or we want to hire another VP of engineering. We still like this person, our VP of engineering. And now what are you going to do with this person? Are you going to now give them a new title, which is going to be really painful? You like this person, but by giving them a title that was not the right title for them long-term, you essentially lost this person because they almost have no other choice when there's a new VP of engineering coming and you're going to demote them, quote unquote, by making them director of engineering. They have no other choice but to quit for the most part. So in general, I feel strongly that except for the title of CEO, CFO, and maybe general counsel, which are needed by Wall Street and regulators and so on, especially in financial services, you can do with the head of XYZ for almost every other function. Maybe sales is slightly different. Sales is external facing. I'm curious, Amrish, what is your opinion on titles? How has it evolved over the years?
You're absolutely right. I've actually completely struggled with my own self when it comes to titles. So when I took over at Pine Labs, in the first press release which was going out, it was actually stating Amrish Rau joins as the Chief Executive Officer. And I was so unhappy with that Chief Executive Officer. I tried to change it for something different. And then the only okay I got from my PR team is, you can put it CEO. I'm saying, okay, at least it sounds less cheesy than Chief Executive Officer. So I go with the CEO title. There's no other way to put it. Hey, but look, Gokul, outside in, I know you've been looking at India, investing in India. Outside in, what are the few areas in fintech are you finding exciting? Maybe even broader than fintech, but what are the sectors that you find very interesting?
I think what is awesome about India right now is that even today, I think there's enough foundational things that need to be built and foundational services. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy, the foundational things are still being built. They were still being built 10 years ago, and they're still being built. And I think even the next 5 years, they're still being built. So if I think about three big buckets, one of them is healthcare. I think the healthcare infrastructure in India there's a bunch of interesting companies doing interesting things. Financial services, obviously, I think probably number one. There's a reason. I mean, it literally has the opportunity to pull billion plus people out of poverty and out of, essentially just change their lives fundamentally. And then education. I think obviously we know all of these incredible companies that have come out over the last 2-3 years, and the notion that Indian children and all the way through high school have essentially spent a full year, and even now there's still many of them schools haven't opened up, has resulted in these incredible startups that have come out and have become maybe the topmost valued or scaled edutech companies in the world. And I think India can lead the world there. And then finally, logistics infrastructure. So I think logistics overall, moving goods and services around the country, that infrastructure is still not where it should be for where we need the GDP to go and where we need the country to grow. So broadly speaking, logistics infrastructure for transportation, trucking, shipping, all of these things, I think moving goods and services around is pretty powerful. Within financial services, I think BNPL, buy now, pay later, and credit, different ways of assessing businesses and individuals for credit. For example, Pine Labs has a ton of data. I would argue that you all you're a better credit bureau for your businesses than any other entity. And there's a very interesting opportunity there. Similarly, I think Flipkart probably has a lot of consumer data that they could essentially build a consumer credit line better than almost any bank and much more holistic. So I think there's a lot of interesting innovations around credit, because credit is the lubricant of an economy, because I still remember when I came to the US, I'd never used a credit card before. And I was always like, I would take cash and I would spend it in India. But as soon as I got a credit card, I was like, oh, I'm never going to, go into debt. I'll never use it. But once you start using credit, you just spend. And so it's kind of incredible. And obviously you've got to spend wisely and carefully. But availability of credit, I think, is a massive unlock for any person in the world. And so I think BNPL and ability to extend credit in scalable, frictionless ways across all transactions, which companies like Pine and others can enable, could be a massive game changer. Very excited about that. Amrish, you have a unique outside in, I would say, but as much inside out view into India and into Indian fintech. What do you think?
See, look, you talked about this whole credit opportunity. I'm a big believer that the credit opportunity in India has not been, tapped as yet. There is lots that we need to do in terms of data quality and then providing credit at the right point to the consumer. And we in Pine Labs, as you know, on our BNPL platform, we are doing a lot of that. But also there's a last piece which is around collections and the laws associated to collections, which really need to come into place. But credit is an opportunity which is looking very exciting. I think the other piece is we haven't scratched the surface when it comes to online payments or card not present transactions. The way I see this is it's not even day one, but almost in the cricket parlances, you're in the ground. The crowd is all excited. The first ball is about to get bowled. That's where we are when it comes to online payments. So I'm quite excited with what will happen in the whole online payment space over the next 10 years, and that's where we are investing heavily into, and that's where we will be launching our product Plural. Last question for you, Gokul, before we let you go. Based on what you just talked about in terms of BNPL, you love the Square and Afterpay combination, I guess.
100%. I'm a huge fan of the deal. I think it makes perfect sense. It connects Square. One of the biggest challenges that Square had is they had two different ecosystems: the merchant ecosystem with the core merchant products and the consumer ecosystem with Cash App. BNPL beautifully connects both of those, and I think it gives a product that really links both of them together in a unique way. And I think it makes them a unique company, because most companies are either merchant first or consumer first. It's extremely rare to have a company. There's only maybe 3-4 companies that are both merchant, have a large merchant business and a large consumer business. And a consumer brand. It's just hard to build that DNA. And so very, very excited for them as a shareholder. And I think it's a great move. Obviously expensive, but great assets are never cheap. And they look cheap in retrospect, whether you look at YouTube or Instagram or DoubleClick. So I suspect that 10 years from now, we'll be looking back and saying that was a good deal and a great deal.
Hey, Gokul, thanks for taking time today. It was great to host you. We appreciate all that you do for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amrish. It was awesome.
Thank you.